Clive Staples Lewis, famously known as C.S. Lewis, is perhaps most famous for the Chronicles of Narnia or some of his Christian books, such as Mere Christianity or Screwtape Letters, both of which and more of which I do go on about a fair amount on my YouTube channel. But one of his lesser known works, this book, and therefore, in my opinion, one of his most underrated after having read it, is a book called Till We Have Faces. Let's talk about it. Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Lydia and I'm the self-proclaimed C.S. Lewis fan club. I love C.S. Lewis. So we will get into it. Let me not start already. We'll get into it. But I firstly just want to begin by saying thank you to whichever of you actually recommended this book in my YouTube comment section. Because without you, I wouldn't have discovered it so soon. I'd certainly never even heard of it before. And just a reminder that I do review all the books that I read on Goodreads. I'll link my Goodreads account down below. Add me as a friend if that's helpful. Oh, frog in my throat. I also recently filmed a video called Tier Ranking All the Books I've Read, in which I kind of gave one-sentence reviews of the books I've read as an adult reader, but I didn't mention there that if you want more in-depth reviews, head on over to my Goodreads account. I've also got notes, because lots of what I am about to say I have already said on Goodreads, but this book was just too good not to warrant a whole video. And it's one of those books that I finished it last night and I just had to sit there and process, because I didn't exactly know how to articulate everything I wanted to say, but I really wanted to make a video on it. So that's what we're doing today. So we're going to begin with a quote. Prepare yourself. Enter speech marks or quotation marks. I ended my first book with the words, "No answer. I know now, Lord, why you utter no answer. You yourself are the answer. Before your face, questions die away. What other answer would suffice? Only words, words to be led out to battle against other words. Long did I hate you, long did I fear you. I might..." First of all, suffice. Is that the correct pronunciation? I think it is. I always get confused with the word preface. So yeah, same vibe. Anyway, there are two things that I want to draw your attention to in this quote. The first is that this quote is the first time in the whole book that the word Lord, the title, Lord, is capitalized. These are the final words of our protagonist, Orwell, and they basically summarize the point of the whole book. And if you like, here's a, introductory one-sentence summary, which is that in this book, a deeply flawed protagonist goes on a journey of self-understanding and ends up discovering who the true God is, which I think is summarised in this quote very nicely, and also by the use of a capital letter, because all throughout the book, it's been lowercase g gods, and finally we've got a capital L to represent her finding the true God. I really feel like we're doing an English literature analysis, which I'm here for. I'm honestly here for it. I loved prepping for this video, and yeah, I mean, it's why I'm studying English, isn't it, I suppose. So anyway, secondly, the quote reminds me of a different quote very, very prominently from Lewis's autobiographical work that I've also read called Surprised by Joy. You might have heard of it. And this is the quote, which is very, very famous. Quotation marks. You must picture me alone in that room in Magdalen, night after night, feeling, whenever my mind lifted even for a second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of him, capital H, whom I so earnestly desired not to meet. That which I greatly feared had at last come upon me. In the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God, and knelt and prayed. Perhaps that night, the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England. Lewis is famously known as the reluctant convert. I actually just argued a point about Christians can be rational thinkers, using him as an example, because he was a very rational thinker, and it kind of contributed to the reason why he's described as the reluctant convert, because he almost didn't want to be a Christian, but looked at the evidence and just found that it was the truth that he couldn't avoid any longer. So perhaps you can see by this description of his conversion, that the conversion of the protagonist until we have faces, the quote I've just read, kind of mirrors his own conversion, or maybe that's just what I got from it. I thought that there were definitely similar tones and themes in the protagonist's conversion and how it's presented in the book, such as, I know now, Lord, that you are the answer. So it takes the whole book to come to that conclusion. So I also want to get a little bit into the mythology this book is based around, which I am going to be reading because I can't memorize it, because it's a myth and I need to get it right, because else it will become a myth, but from Lydia's perspective. So I'm going to read it. But yeah, this book, Till We Have Faces, is a retelling in the form of a novel, which I love, by the way. I put this on my review. Just having a novel which also incorporates profound Christian truths, that's my favourite type of book. Period. That's my favourite type of book. Yeah, so it's a retelling of the myth of Cupid and Psyche. You probably will have heard of Cupid. You might have heard of this myth. And I'll save you the time of Googling it, and I will summarise it here, so bear with me. Let's begin. A king and a queen had 3 daughters, the youngest of whom was so beautiful that people worshipped her as a goddess, thereby neglecting worship of Venus. This youngest daughter is Psyche. Out of jealousy, the goddess Venus sent a plague and let it be known that the only way that the land would return to normal would be if Psyche was sacrificed. In jealousy, Venus ordered her son Cupid, you might have heard of him, the god of love, to punish Psyche by making her fall in love with disreputable men. So Cupid sets off to do this, but he actually ends up falling in love with Psyche himself. So, as Psyche was left on the mountain to be sacrificed, Cupid had Psyche carried off to a secret place where he prepared a palace and could visit her by night as her husband, but forbid her to see his face. So he's ended up falling in love with her, marries her, and they meet in this secret place, but only in nighttime. So she can't see who he is, that he is Cupid. Psyche then begs her now husband to allow her a visit from her 2 sisters, Redevil and Orwell. Lewis's tale is told from the perspective of Orwell and her visits to Psyche. So we see that happen in the book, like from Lewis's retelling perspective. Seeing Psyche and her happiness in the palace and being married, Orwell is filled with envy because she starts comparing her life to the life of Psyche. She decides to convince Psyche that her husband is actually a monstrous being, which is why he won't let her see his face. And Orwell persuades Psyche to take a lamp into the bedroom of her and her now husband and use the lamp to reveal Psyche's husband's horrific face and see the truth. But obviously it's Cupid, so like this is not true. But Orwell is just driven by envy, and so hatches this plot to kind of get her to expose her husband. But basically what happens is Psyche takes the lamp into the bedroom, but Cupid actually wakes up and he rebukes her from his sight. He's like, get out. Psyche had disobeyed him because he commanded her not to see his face. Cupid then took measures to lead both of Psyche's sisters, Redevil and Orwell, to their death. Meanwhile, castaway Psyche falls into the hands of her greatest enemy, Venus, who took her for a slave and sets her a series of impossible tasks, which I won't detail here, but you'll likely be familiar with some of them because I definitely was. I think I studied it in like primary school. For example, Pandora's box, which I didn't realise was kind of all part of the same thing. In the end of this myth, that I'm telling to make sense of Till We Have Faces, Cupid comes to Psyche and actually forgives her. He intercedes and their marriage is permitted by the gods, and Psyche is made into a goddess. Venus is reconciled and they all live happily ever after. So it's kind of important. I went into this book not researching that myth, and then a little bit into the book I just figured I had no idea what was going on, so I googled the myth because it says in the blurb that it's retelling of that myth, and once I kind of had the basic premise of that mythology in my mind, it really helped me read it. So I think it's necessary for you to know that if you're gonna go and read this book. So, onto the book. Lewis's tale is sourced from this myth, but what I loved so much is that he incorporates profound Christian truths throughout. Of course, he does. It's C.S. Lewis. It's one of the reasons I love him so much. I will admit, though, when I saw the blurb of this book and the fact that it was like a retelling of a myth, I was a bit like, how am I going to enjoy this? Does it kind of sound like my thing? And I wondered how a book about like lowercase g gods could fit into Lewis's like 40 or so other books, which are all about Jesus and Christianity. But as I read through the book, I was amazed at the deep spiritual truths. And of course, he found a way to combine the two in just such a profound, amazing way with his amazing creative writing and Christian faith, and just all combined, meaning he's like literally my favourite author of all time. So, like I said, Till We Have Faces is from the point of view of Arowal, Psyche's sister. And here is, in my opinion, the main profound Christian truth which I got from this book. Are you ready? Arowal realizes that the gods will not meet us face to face until we have faces. Title drop. Meaning that we must first come to full self-understanding that we are sinners to see the face of God, knowing that Jesus is our saviour, basically. Faith is the gift of God, and it's only when he opens our eyes that we can see him for who he is. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? The idea of till we have faces. So we must come to self-understanding. We had a sermon at church about it literally a couple of weeks back. We must know who we are and who Jesus is, meaning that we are sinners and he is our saviour. So that's the basic premise. Also, in the book, Arowal wears a veil, and I kind of saw that to represent her spiritual blindness throughout the book, because like I mentioned, she goes on a journey of self-understanding, so it only makes sense for her to get to the point that I outlined at the beginning with that long quote about her knowing who God is. She must first go through that journey, and she's blind, spiritually blind, and then can see God for who he really is. And it's separated into two books. So she finishes the book, and then she writes like another book at the end, which is when she's beginning to kind of come to conclusions about kind of how her behaviour has been wrong and how she's not who she thought herself to be, etc. Basically, this journey of self-understanding. So yeah, this kind of spiritual blindness, she wears a veil, which I saw to represent it. It kind of is shown by her following worldly things, following sinful desires, and looking to all these other small g gods. Yeah, the veil can kind of be seen to represent all those things. And it also represents our spiritual blindness before God. And in his grace, he opens our eyes. You know, we did when Jesus heals a blind man at church the other week at small group, and just how that can be seen to represent our spiritual blindness and how he takes our spiritual blindness away. We can see him for who he is. We can, you know, amazing grace, I was blind but now I see. So that's my little review of the book. That's kind of a bit what it's about. I didn't really want to give spoilers, but it's kind of a commonly known myth, so I don't know how well I've done with that. But I just wanted to basically inspire you to read this book, because like I mentioned at the beginning, I truly believe this is such an underrated book. I had not even heard of it. Like, prior to reading this book, I was a self-proclaimed C.S. Lewis fan club, but I'd never heard of it. It's a bit bizarre. So here's me getting the word out to our little YouTube family. So now what I want to do is, as you can see, I actually put on Goodreads. Someone stopped me from tabbing this book because I will run out of post-it notes. I was actually quite restrained with the number. I don't think that's even focusing. That's so funny. Oh, there you go. I was actually quite restrained with the number of tabs I put in this book. I just kind of tabbed the most profound bits to me, which I kind of just want to run you through. A couple of quotes now. The first quote: "You don't think, not possibly, not as a mere 100th chance, there might be things that are real though we can't see them?" I wonder why I tabbed this quote. Well, obviously, it's because it felt like it was quite early on in the book when I was still coming to terms with like how has Lewis written this? How is this Christian? Is this Christian, etc.? But this felt like a small nod to Lewis's Christian faith. The idea about, we believe in an invisible God. Obviously, Jesus is God incarnate. But yeah, the second quote, perhaps in the soul, as in the soil, those growths that show the brightest colours and put forth the most overpowering smell have not always the deepest root. So profound, so profound. This quote describes a romantic love that Arowell has, who then dies. I'm not going to spoil it because I don't think it's clear who it is throughout the book. So, but once he passes away, this love withers very quickly. It kind of speaks to humanity's nature and obsessions and maybe shallowness. I don't know. I just got a lot of comfort from that quote, and it was obviously very poetic. What's the word? I'm literally studying English. What's the word when something just sounds nice? I can't think of the word. But there we go. It just sounds very nice to read that quote out. Next quote is just a simple phrase. It says, "The dark holiness of Ungit's house." Okay, I need to explain a bit of context. I was Googling, I think it was lit charts. It was when I found out that this book had a lit charts page that I was like, oh, there is symbolism in this book. So apparently Ungit, who's the main small g god described throughout most of the book, can actually be seen to represent Satan, and yet she's the one who's worshipped, especially by Orwell. So the fact that we've got the words dark and holiness, those words juxtapose so powerfully, because holiness is God is holy, he is without sin, he is without blemish, but dark is never a word that we'd use to describe God. So I was just a bit like, dark holiness, this God, Ungit, there's definitely more to her than first meets the eye, and we do find that out in the book. But yeah, of course, Satan isn't holy, but he is dark. He's the prince of darkness, is that how he's described in the Bible? The father of lies. So it makes sense that Ungit would represent Satan. And then on that note, another quote, "All, even Psyche, are born into the house of Ungit, and all must get free from her." Kind of the idea of original sin. I don't know, we're all born with a sinful nature and we must be born again, Jesus says. That's what it said to me. Next up, "Each person, doubtless with a dozen cares and sorrows upon him, brackets, who has not?" The other day in my devotional time, I was reading about Paul's thorn in the flesh, and I never made this link before, how Jesus has a crown of thorns, and that could be seen to show how Jesus takes our thorns, our suffering, our sin upon himself. And he's conquered it all. But it doesn't mean we won't experience suffering in this life, but in the next we won't, because Jesus conquered sin and death. Amazing. So I don't know, I just liked that Lewis kind of gave a nod to the Christian theology, which says that we will suffer in this life. Because a lot of kind of churches say that that's not God's will, but the Bible's very clear that if you're a Christian, you're not exempt from suffering. But God is present with us, and Jesus has ultimately conquered it all. Okay, next quote. "The day passed somehow. All days pass, and that's a great comfort. Just nice, just to remember when you're having a bad day." Next up, "What I, Orwell, had sought in vain by meeting the joyous and terrible brutes, she, Psyche, took at her leisure." I'm going to put that on the screen because I think you need to see it. It's hard to understand just hearing it. It is for me anyway. I'm definitely a visual learner. So I don't actually think that this is what the quote is referring to, but what I got from this quote is it just reminded me of how in Christ we have riches at leisure because of what Jesus has done, and we've been freed from working for salvation, which will of course never work, we'll never be able to accomplish that. But I don't know, we were talking in uni about how you can interpret text different ways, and that's kind of the beauty of it to an extent. So even if this isn't what Lewis meant, because I was reading about how certain characters could be seen to represent, or a certain character could be seen to represent Christ. So I'm not sure if I'm right in this, but I don't know, just the idea that one character is seeking after something in vain, and then another is taking it at their leisure. It kind of reminded me of works-based religions versus Christianity, which is grace through faith. Next up, really short quote, another bore nearly all the anguish. Jesus, he bore our anguish upon himself. Finally, did we really do these things to her, I asked. This is Orwell speaking. Yes, all his true. And we said we loved her, and we did. She had no more dangerous enemies than us. So a good note to end on this is, I feel like it just summarises the point of the book. I mentioned about how Orwell goes on a journey of self-understanding, and she just comes to realise that, well, it's summarised in that one line, she had no more dangerous enemies than us. Her love of Psyche consumed Psyche to the point where it led to kind of her destruction. So yeah, it's just very, very profound. At first I was like, does Lewis want me to hate this protagonist? Not hate, that's the wrong word to use. Does Lewis want me to really dislike the protagonist? Like, what's going on here? But I think, honestly, the point of this book is to see ourselves in Orwell and our sin, and how we all must go on this journey of self-understanding to discover the real God, and to not follow, the Bible says, the prince of this world, Satan, not follow culture, not follow false teachers, and ultimately come to discover who the Lord, capital L, is. So it's my little video on this book. This year I'm not doing monthly book wrap-ups. I did them last year. I just felt like, I don't know, I feel like I don't necessarily want to review every book, because some books I might have a really negative experience with, and it just doesn't make me feel good going on about negative things about a book. But if a book is really fabulous, as this was, then it warrants its own video. So this year we're not doing monthly book wrap-ups, but I will be doing these videos if and when a book is as powerful and as worth recommending as this book is. So thank you for being here. Hope you've enjoyed. Please go and read this book, or download it on Kindle, or get it from the library, or get it secondhand. You know that I'm an advocate for secondhand buying books, because we don't all have the funds, and that is okay. But I always think that money spent on a book that's going to help you grow in your faith, that you can share with others, is not money spent in vain, to an extent, obviously. So I'll see you next time. Goodbye and God bless.